Hello econ students, welcome to today's video. Previously we learned about the different macroeconomic objectives that governments might have. Policymakers often need to intervene in the macroeconomy in order to promote full employment or to reduce inflation or in order to achieve any other macroeconomic objectives that the government might have, such as reducing income inequality between the rich and the poor. Today we'll look into one of the ways of achieving these macroeconomic objectives, that is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the use of government revenue collection, which is mainly taxes, and government spending in order to influence the economy. The idea of fiscal policy is really simple. When the economy is going too slow or too fast, the government can step on the accelerator or the brake by changing level of government spending and taxation. In most countries, it is done by the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, and the fiscal policy needs to be approved by country's parliament. Fiscal policy is a demand-side policy. Therefore, it functions by changing the level of aggregate demand in the economy. And the two instruments of fiscal policy is government spending and taxation. Before we proceed to learn more about fiscal policy, let's try to recap our understanding of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total demand in the economy. It represents all the spending that was done in the economy over a period of time. Aggregate demand's components are C, which is consumer expenditure. I represents private investment, that is investment done by all the businesses. This includes things like construction, expansion of businesses, starting of new businesses, and so on. The third component of aggregate demand is G, which represents government spending or public spending. They're the same thing. So all the spending that is done by the government is also part of the total demand of the economy. And lastly, you have net export. X here represents export and M represents import. Imports are subtracted because these are goods and services that were produced in other countries. Moving on, there are two types of fiscal policy: expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy involves expanding the aggregate demand in the economy. Expansionary fiscal policy is usually implemented when there is a recession in the economy. Recession is when economic growth is low, output in the economy is dwindling, and when there is high unemployment in the economy. So the idea of expansionary fiscal policy is that this policy would try to expand the aggregate demand, hence it is called expansionary fiscal policy. So if there is, let's say, high unemployment in the economy, unemployment is usually caused by lack of demand for goods and services. So when demand for goods and services in the economy would increase, automatically there will be higher demand for workers, and that would create more jobs. If the government wants to increase aggregate demand in the economy to boost output, it can do by increasing government spending or public spending and by reducing taxes. Taxation and public spending are the two instruments of fiscal policy. In expansionary fiscal policy, government spending would go up and taxations would be reduced. And we will see how these two components increase aggregate demand in the economy. We will look into how reducing taxes can increase aggregate demand. If taxes on personal income are reduced by the government, this would increase disposable income of consumers. Disposable income is income left over after consumers or people have paid their taxes. When people have more disposable income, they would be able to spend this money on buying more goods and services. Therefore, consumer expenditure would increase. And as you know, consumer expenditure, C, is a component of aggregate demand. When consumer expenditure increases, this will immediately increase aggregate demand in the economy. And when there is higher aggregate demand, obviously this would create more jobs and economic growth would be increased as there is going to be higher output in the economy. When businesses invest more money in the economy, they would employ more people, people would earn higher income, and in this way, cutting taxes increases aggregate demand. Higher aggregate demand means greater output in the economy, hence higher economic growth and more jobs. Increase in public spending also increases aggregate demand. As government expenditure or public expenditure G increases, that increases aggregate demand and it creates more job. We'll look into this example, how a government expenditure of $10 billion to build and equip a new hospital leads to multiplier effect. Multiplier effect means that the total increase in output in the economy is far greater than the initial expenditure in the economy. In this example, government spends $10 billion to build and equip a new hospital. This creates a multiplier effect in the economy. A multiplier effect means that the final increase in output in the economy would be far greater than the initial government spending of $10 billion. And we will see how that happens. When government builds this hospital, it creates income for the construction company. The construction company, in turn, would employ building workers, and they would earn money from here. They would go and spend this money on supermarkets and buying goods and services, things like buying food, getting a car, and other things that they would consume. That would create demand for goods and services. That would increase demand for goods and services that are produced by the industry. The industry would earn higher profits, therefore they would expand and also employ more industrial workers. Industrial workers' income is also going to further increase. Due to all of these increases, shop workers would be employed and their incomes also would likely to go up. When the hospital is operational, it would employ doctors and nurses, and therefore that would also contribute to increase in income in the economy. Now, what I want you to see here is that the initial spending of $10 billion in the economy would lead to far greater increase in total output and income in the economy, and that is what we refer as multiplier effect. And this is how government spending can boost aggregate demand in the economy. Now we will look into contractionary fiscal policy. As the word suggests, it is opposite of expansionary fiscal policy. In contractionary fiscal policy, the aggregate demand contracts. It is usually implemented to control inflation in an economy. Inflation is sustained increase in the general price level. Inflation is often caused by too much demand in the economy. So one way to control this inflation is to put brake on the economy by trying to reduce aggregate demand. So when taxes in the economy are reduced, that will reduce disposable income that people have. When people have less disposable income, they would spend less, and that would bring down consumer expenditure. And when consumer expenditure goes down, aggregate demand in the economy would go down. And as we learned before, the relationship between demand and price. When demand goes down, price of goods and services would go down. But here we're not looking at individual demand and individual price, we're looking at the aggregate demand, that is the total demand in the economy. So when aggregate demand goes down, the general price level for goods and services would also go down. So this is one way how contractionary fiscal policy is implemented. The other way contractionary fiscal policy is implemented is by reducing government spending. Government would reduce spending by cutting wages and cutting down on different projects that it is spending money on. And when government expenditure goes down, it reduces total demand in the economy and the price level would also go down. The fiscal policy is also used by government as an instrument to reduce income inequality within the economy. So obviously, as I told you, the government spends money on providing different services and welfare benefits and so on, and it also taxes. So the government could tax the high income group and use some of this money to provide welfare benefits to the very poor. such as providing free healthcare, subsidized education, and other training schemes so the poor can increase the skills level and earn higher income, and the gap between the very rich and the very poor can be reduced. So fiscal policy is also an instrument to redistribute income within the economy. Fiscal policy is a very useful tool to control the macroeconomy. However, it does come with its own share of problems. Fiscal policy is very cumbersome to use. It is difficult for government to know how much to expand government spending or cut taxes during economic downturn. Secondly, increase in public expenditure can crowd out private spending. To finance an increase in public spending and reduction in taxes, government may need to borrow extra money that it needs from private sector. The more money the private sector would lend to government, less would be available to spend on itself. This is called crowding out. Because if government is borrowing all the money from the banks would have less money available to lend out to private individuals and businesses. That would impact the ability of businesses to expand, and therefore that could reduce investment, and it would also affect people's ability to buy goods and services through borrowing money, because people often make big expenditure by borrowed money. When they're buying a house or a car, they often borrow money from the bank. But if the banks have less money available because they have lended them all out to the government, it can cause crowding out effect. Thirdly, increasing taxes on income and profits can reduce incentive to work and enterprise. With increase in taxes, businesses and individuals would reduce their work effort because they wouldn't see the point of working harder if most of the extra money earned is taken away by the government. And when productivity falls, output and profits would also fall. And due to fall in productivity, firms would find it difficult to compete on price and quality of the product, and they may lose out to overseas competitors who are more efficient. As a result, demand for goods and services would fall and unemployment may rise. An expansionary fiscal policy creates expectation of inflation. When government announces tax cuts or big expenditure, firms and individuals would expect prices to increase, and that expectation could actually cause inflation. Another policy conflict with contractionary fiscal policy is that it might lead to loss of job. Contractionary fiscal policy is often applied in order to control inflation. And in contractionary fiscal policy, taxes are increased and government spending is reduced, and combination of these two can lead to loss of jobs, and therefore there is a policy conflict here. So government might be able to control inflation, but unemployment might go up. And that is the problem with most of our policy. When government tries to achieve one macroeconomic objective, it might create another. Therefore, governments always need to use multiple policies in order to create this balance in the economy and reach equilibrium. So there are often policy conflicts with any policy that the government implements. So in this case, we saw when government tries to reduce inflation using contractionary fiscal policy, it creates the problem of unemployment. So there is no correct single policy. Governments would always need to use a combination of different policies in order to keep the economy in equilibrium. And we are going to learn about other instruments and policies used by government in order to achieve macroeconomic objectives. Thank you very much.